My name is Major Molly Martin. I'm 35 years old, and I have just buried the only man who ever saw the person behind the uniform. Just 24 hours after an American flag was folded with solemn precision and placed into my trembling hands, I stood on the threshold of my own home and watched it being pillaged. My father-in-law, Raymond, was directing his sons as they carried out my grandmother's armchair. His voice was cold as steel. The family legacy must be returned to the bloodline, girl. Your tour of duty here is over. My mother-in-law, Patricia, smiled at me, a smile as sweet as Southern iced tea, but laced with contempt. She picked up our wedding photo from the mantel, slid my picture out from behind the glass, and dropped it into a trash bin. "We'll keep the one of Marcus," she said casually. "He doesn't need you in the background anymore anyway." They treated me like a sentry whose watch had ended. But they made a fatal mistake. They thought they were fighting a lone widow. They had no idea they were marching onto a battlefield my husband had already prepared. Let me know where you're listening from in the comments. Hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever been made to feel like an outsider in the very place you called home. The air in Charleston is a living thing. It's heavy, wet, and clings to your skin like a second uniform you can't strip off. After the funeral, after the final salute and the gut-wrenching sound of taps echoing in the humid air, I didn't go home. I couldn't. The silence in that house would have been louder than any battlefield. Instead, I drove back to the base and spent the night in the empty quiet of my office, surrounded by the sterile comfort of government-issue furniture. It was a place of order, of logic, a place where grief had no regulation, but duty did. By morning, I felt steady enough. I'd put on my uniform, not the dress blues, but my daily fatigues. It felt like armor. I pulled my Jeep onto our quiet, oak-lined street. Sunlight filtered through the Spanish moss, painting dappled patterns on the pavement. It looked peaceful, serene, a perfect picture of Southern tranquility. But as I walked up the brick pathway to my front door, the first alarm bell sounded in my head. The door was slightly ajar. I never left it ajar. My hand went to my pocket, fumbling for my keys out of pure habit. I slid the key into the lock. It didn't turn. I tried again, pushing harder. Nothing. It felt like hitting a wall of solid steel. My key, the key to my home for 8 years, was useless. They had changed the locks. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. I took a steadying breath, straightened my back, and pressed the doorbell. The chimes echoed inside, a cheerful melodic sound that felt like a mockery. After a long moment, the door creaked open. My brother-in-law, Timothy, stood there, shirtless, a half-eaten bag of potato chips in his hand. He looked at me not with sympathy but with annoyance, like I was a door-to-door salesman interrupting his Saturday morning. "Oh, it's you," he mumbled through a mouthful of chips. He didn't move aside. I had to step around him to enter my own home. And then I saw it. The living room wasn't a home anymore. It was a staging area for an evacuation. My father-in-law, Raymond Coleman, stood in the center of the room like a 4-star general surveying a conquered territory. He held a clipboard, a pen tucked behind his ear, and was directing 2 movers I didn't recognize. The air was thick with the cloying humidity of Charleston and the sharp, cheap scent of Raymond's cigar smoke. He looked up, his eyes sweeping over me without a flicker of compassion. "You're back sooner than we expected," he said, his voice flat. "No, I'm sorry for your loss." "No, how are you holding up?" "Just a statement of tactical inconvenience." He tapped his clipboard. "We're proceeding with the transfer." That word, transfer. He said it like he was talking about a military base being decommissioned, not a home being ripped apart. Not the home where Marcus and I had hosted barbecues, celebrated Christmases, and held each other on the nights before my deployments. Just then, a voice dripped down from the top of the stairs, sweet as honey laced with arsenic. "Well, look who's here." Patricia, my mother-in-law, descended, holding my jewelry box. It was a simple wooden box Marcus had bought me at a craft fair in Ohio. She opened the lid and peered inside with a look of distaste. "My, these things look awfully simple, Molly dear," she cooed, her southern drawl thickening. "Are these standard issue? You can take them, of course. We have no need for them." My breath hitched, but I said nothing. Then her eyes landed on the wall above the fireplace. It was my wall of honor. My framed medals, the bronze star, the purple heart, commendations from tours in places she couldn't pronounce. They were a testament to my service, to the blood and sweat I'd given for my country. Patricia wrinkled her nose. "Gerald," she called to her other son, who was taping up a box of books. "Take those things down. They simply don't match the aesthetic of the house." The words hit me harder than any physical blow. It wasn't about the house. It wasn't about aesthetics. It was about erasure. They were systematically removing any trace that I, Major Molly Martin, had ever existed within these walls. The disrespect for my service, for the very symbols of my sacrifice, was a deeper violation than them changing the locks. I finally found my voice. It came out low and steady, the voice of a commander, not a grieving widow. "What do you think you're doing?" Raymond turned slowly, deliberately. He took the cigar from his mouth and looked me up and down, his eyes lingering on my uniform, with disdain. "Listen here, girl," he said, his voice dropping to a menacing calm. "Marcus may have married you, but he couldn't make you a Coleman. Blood is blood. This property, this legacy, was built on the sweat of our ancestors. It will not be left in the hands of a transient soldier who could be shipped off at a moment's notice." Every word was a calculated strike, a dismissal of our 8-year marriage, a negation of the love Marcus and I shared, an insult to the uniform I wore with pride. He was reducing my entire life to a temporary assignment. He must have seen the fury hardening in my eyes because he moved in for the final blow. He gestured around the room. "You have 2 hours to collect your personal effects. Anything left after that will be considered family property and disposed of accordingly." A final eviction notice. A cold, legalistic severing. My training kicked in. When faced with an ambush, you don't charge blindly. You assess, you gather intelligence, you find the tactical advantage. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I didn't argue. Instead, I took a single step back, leaned against the wall, and crossed my arms. My face became a neutral mask. I watched. I watched as Timothy directed a mover to take my grandmother's armchair, the one with the worn floral pattern where her head used to rest. I watched as Gerald took down my medals, handling them with the careless indifference of a man packing away old Christmas decorations. I watched Patricia walk through the rooms, pointing at things, claiming them. And I watched Raymond, the patriarch, overseeing the dismantling of my life with the smug satisfaction of a conqueror. They saw a defeated woman, a widow broken by grief, too weak to fight back. They were wrong. They were being observed by an intelligence officer. I was memorizing every smug look, every cruel word, every stolen object. I was cataloging their weaknesses, their arrogance, their greed. My silence wasn't surrender. It was surveillance, and it was making them more uncomfortable than any hysterical outburst ever could. That armchair. It was the last piece of my grandmother I had. And as I watched them carry it out the front door, I remembered the first time they made me feel like none of my history, none of who I was, ever mattered to them at all. They had always looked at me like that, like I was an inconvenient piece of furniture that didn't match their decor, an object to be tolerated, moved around, and eventually disposed of. It started from the very first day, 8 years ago, long before the locks were changed or my medals were taken off the wall. It started at a dinner table. I remember that dinner like a mission briefing I can't erase from my memory. I had spent a week preparing. I bought a conservative navy blue dress from a Charleston boutique, something elegant but not flashy. I read up on local politics. I even practiced a few pleasant anecdotes about growing up in Ohio that I thought might bridge the gap between my world and theirs. I wanted so badly to make a good impression, to show them I was worthy of their son. When Marcus ushered me into their sprawling colonial home, the first thing I noticed was the silence. It was the kind of heavy, oppressive quiet that absorbs all sound. The second was the gleam. Everything was polished to a mirror shine: the mahogany dining table, the silver candlesticks, the hardwood floors. It felt less like a home and more like a museum exhibit on Southern aristocracy. We sat down to a formal dinner of shrimp and grits, a dish I had never tasted before. Patricia started the interrogation, disguised as polite conversation. She smiled, a perfectly painted, motionless smile, and tilted her head. "Marcus tells us you're a captain in the army, dear," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "You command men?" "Yes, ma'am," I replied. "A logistics company." She murmured, taking a delicate sip of her iced tea. "It must be very loud." She said the word loud like it was a contagious disease, something unrefined and dirty that I had brought into her pristine home. The implication was clear. I was loud. My life was loud. I didn't belong in their world of quiet, old money. Then Raymond cleared his throat, fixing me with a gaze that felt like a performance evaluation. "And your family, they're back in Ohio?" he asked. "Yes, sir. My dad retired last year." "He worked in the steel mills, I understand," Raymond continued. Not as a question, but as a statement of fact. Of course he knew. I realized later he'd probably run a full background check on me. "Honest work," he declared, his tone dripping with condescension. He made it sound noble in the way one might describe a sturdy, simple-minded workhorse. He was talking about my father, the man who worked double shifts his entire life to give me a future he never had. As if he were a character in a history book about the working class. For the rest of the meal, they never asked about my dreams, my passions, or what made me fall in love with their son. They performed a clinical dissection of my resume and my roots, holding each piece up to the light and finding it flawed. I left that dinner feeling like I had failed an inspection I never knew I was undergoing. The scrutiny only intensified. A week before our wedding, Raymond requested a meeting. Not at his home, but at his sanctuary, the Charleston Country Club. He sat across from me on the veranda, overlooking the perfectly manicured golf course, a sea of green for the city's elite. Surrounded by men in pastel polo shirts and crisp khaki shorts, he got straight to the point. "I need you to sign a prenuptial agreement," he said, stirring his Arnold Palmer without looking at me. "It's a simple matter of protecting Marcus's assets, the family's assets." I was stunned, but I kept my voice even. "Raymond, I'm not interested in Marcus's money. I'm marrying him because I love him." He finally looked at me, a smirk playing on his lips. "That's what they all say," he said dismissively. "But your career, it's a high-risk variable. Deployments, war zones. A soldier's life is inherently unstable. We can't have our family's legacy tied to such an uncertain future." He wasn't talking about my safety. He wasn't worried about me. He was risk-assessing my life. Our marriage wasn't a union of love to him. It was a volatile stock he needed to hedge against. He was treating my service to the country as a financial liability. Through it all, Marcus was my saving grace. He saw the subtle digs, the dismissive glances, the cold shoulders. That night, after the dinner, he held me in his arms in the small apartment we rented, a world away from his parents' mansion. His own voice was filled with pain. "I'm so sorry, Moll. They don't get it," he whispered into my hair. "They don't see you. All they see is the uniform." And he was right. They saw the uniform as a costume, a symbol of a world they didn't understand or approve of. But Marcus saw it as a part of me, but not all of me. He saw the woman who loved stray dogs and bad action movies. The woman who could be tough as nails on the outside but who cried during sappy commercials. He was my only ally in this silent, chilly war. His love was my shelter. I kept trying, though, for him. That first Christmas after we were married, I spent weeks knitting a scarf for Patricia. It was a beautiful, soft cashmere in a deep emerald green I thought would complement her eyes. I poured hours into it, each stitch a silent plea for acceptance. On Christmas morning, amidst a mountain of expensive gifts under their towering tree, I handed her my small, carefully wrapped present. She opened it and smiled that same, placid smile. "Oh my, you're quite crafty, aren't you?" she said. She held it up for a moment, then turned to their housekeeper, a lovely woman named Eleanor, who was quietly serving coffee. "Eleanor, this would look wonderful on you, a little Christmas bonus." Then, without missing a beat, she turned back and handed Marcus a small, heavy box. Inside was a brand new Rolex. The public humiliation was staggering. The message was unmistakable. My heartfelt effort was worth nothing more than a hand-me-down to the staff. My gift, born of time and hope, was garbage. In that moment, watching the hurt flash in Marcus's eyes before he masked it, I finally understood. It didn't matter how hard I tried. I would never be enough. I would always be the girl from Ohio, the soldier, the outsider. It's a lonely feeling, isn't it? To pour your heart into a gift, only to have it tossed aside. If you've ever felt that sting of rejection, hit that like button and comment with a simple word. I understand. Let's see how many of us have been there. For years, I told myself I could endure their Cold War, that Marcus's love was enough armor. But I was wrong. The Cold War turned hot on a warm summer evening at a cousin's wedding, the night I overheard the truth of their endgame. The night in question was supposed to be a celebration. It was 3 months before Marcus passed away. His cousin was getting married at one of Charleston's historic plantations, a place where the oak trees were older than the country itself, and the air smelled perpetually of sweet tea and old money. The reception was a grand affair under a sprawling white tent, lit by fairy lights that glittered like captive stars. Men in seersucker suits sipped bourbon while women in floral dresses fanned themselves against the humid southern evening. It was a perfect portrait of genteel charm. And like most perfect portraits, it was a beautiful lie. For my part, I was playing a role I'd perfected over 8 years, the dutiful daughter-in-law. Patricia, holding a glass of champagne, steered me through the crowd with a proprietary hand on my elbow. At every cluster of guests, she would perform the same little show. "Have you met Marcus's wife, Molly?" she would say, her voice bright and brittle. Then she would lean in conspiratorially, adding, "She's a major in the army, you know." She always emphasized the word major, not with pride, but as if it were an exotic and slightly alarming credential, like being a lion tamer. It was her way of reminding everyone, and me, that I was the oddity, the cuckoo in their well-appointed nest. I just smiled, shook hands, and answered the same predictable questions about my exciting life, all while feeling like an undercover agent deep in enemy territory. The smiles were my camouflage. After an hour of this performance, I felt the need to escape. The forced pleasantries and the weight of their judgment were suffocating. I murmured an excuse to Marcus and slipped away from the tent, walking toward the mansion's manicured gardens. The air out there was cooler, filled with the intoxicatingly sweet scent of blooming magnolias. I found a stone bench tucked away in an alcove, hidden from view, and just breathed. For 5 minutes, I wasn't Major Martin or the outsider daughter-in-law. I was just Molly, a woman trying to find a moment of peace. When I felt composed enough, I started back towards the reception. The path wound around the side of the house, past a darkened veranda. As I neared the corner, I heard voices drifting from the shadows. Familiar voices. I froze. It was Raymond. He was speaking in a low, conspiratorial tone to his sons, Gerald and Timothy. "When Marcus is gone," he said, his voice stripped of all its public charm, "we have to move fast. Dad's lawyer says a wife has certain residency rights for a period, but we can apply pressure, make things uncomfortable." I pressed myself flat against the cold brick wall of the house, my heart beginning to hammer against my ribs. "She's a soldier," Raymond continued, his voice laced with disdain. "She's used to moving. All we have to do is make it clear she's not welcome, and she'll pack her bags and leave on her own. A clean break." They were talking about Marcus's death, not as a tragedy, not as a potential heartbreak, but as a logistical checkpoint in a business plan. They were strategizing my removal before he was even sick. Then Gerald, the eldest, chimed in, his voice greedy. "The vet clinic is the real prize. I've already spoken to Dr. Henderson. He's ready to make a serious offer the moment it's available." My stomach turned to ice. They weren't just planning to evict me, they were already carving up Marcus's life's work, the clinic he had poured his heart and soul into building. Timothy, ever the follower, sounded nervous. "But what if she puts up a fight? What if she demands something?" A fourth voice joined the conversation, and it was the one that broke me. It was Patricia. She must have just walked up. She let out a soft, contemptuous laugh. "Oh, sweetheart, don't you worry your pretty little head," she said, her voice a venomous whisper. "What is she going to demand? She came into this family with nothing but a duffel bag. She'll leave the same way. You just leave her to me. Woman to woman, I know exactly what to say to make her understand her place." My heart didn't just break, it stopped. The air left my lungs. This wasn't just dislike or prejudice anymore, this was a calculated plot. A cold, cruel, and methodical conspiracy to erase me from their lives and seize everything Marcus and I had built together. The pretty lights of the party seemed to dim. The cheerful music suddenly sounded grotesque and mocking. I was standing in the dark, listening to my own eviction being planned. I don't know how I made it back to the table. I don't know how I managed to smile at Marcus and tell him I was just feeling a little tired. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of detached observation. Every smiling face, every polite conversation felt like a scene from a horror movie. The drive home was silent. The air inside our car was thick and heavy, charged with unspoken words. Marcus kept glancing at me, his brow furrowed with concern. "Moll? What's wrong? You've been quiet all night." I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. The soldier took over. I turned to him, my face calm, and I gave him an after-action report, my voice as steady and even as if I were debriefing a patrol. Objective: full seizure of all assets, including the house and the clinic, I stated, looking straight ahead at the dark road. Method of operation: psychological pressure to induce a voluntary withdrawal. Timeline for execution: immediately following your death. Marcus said nothing. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the soft hiss of the tires on the asphalt. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He didn't question me. He didn't doubt me. He knew. He had always known what they were capable of. We pulled into our driveway. He turned off the engine, plunging us into darkness and silence. He turned to face me. The soft, gentle man I loved was gone. In his place was someone I'd never seen before. His eyes, usually so warm and kind, were now sharp, cold, and utterly resolute. A fire was burning behind them. "All right," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "They've declared war. It's time we draw up a battle plan." He didn't wait. As soon as we were inside our house, the quiet sanctuary we had built together, Marcus went straight to the hall closet. I watched, confused, as he pulled out a worn leather briefcase I had never seen before. Our small kitchen, with its warm yellow walls and the familiar gurgle of the coffee maker, became a secret war room that night. He placed the briefcase on our little kitchen table, the one where we ate breakfast and paid our bills, and clicked it open. The sound was sharp, definitive. The opening salvo of a war I didn't even know he'd been preparing to fight. "They've always thought I was soft," Marcus began, his voice devoid of its usual gentle warmth. It was now cold, clear, and precise. "They mistook my kindness for weakness. They were wrong." He looked at me, his eyes burning with an intensity that startled me. "I don't fight like they do, Moll. Not with yelling and intimidation and emotional blackmail. I fight like a strategist." He pulled out a thick file folder. "I've been preparing for this for a long time, longer than you know." He explained that the day his father cornered me at the country club, demanding I sign a prenuptial agreement, was the day he knew this battle was inevitable. "It wasn't about protecting me," Marcus said, a bitter edge to his voice. "It was about controlling you, about ensuring you would always be a temporary fixture." So, he had made a move of his own. He didn't go to the polished, respectable family lawyer Raymond kept on retainer. He sought out a man named Charles Peaton, a legal pit bull, a specialist in contentious estate battles with a quiet reputation in Charleston's legal circles. His nickname was the Cleaner, because when he was done, there was never a mess left to argue about. "I've met with Charles twice a year for the past 7 years," Marcus confessed. My jaw nearly hit the floor. For 7 years, my gentle, unassuming husband, the man who rescued stray cats and couldn't kill a spider, had been quietly building a fortress around me. He laid the documents out on the table, turning our kitchen into a command center. I've diagnosed my family's illness, Molly, he said, using his veterinarian's logic. It's a chronic, incurable case of greed. And this, he tapped the stack of papers, is the treatment plan. He showed me the first line of defense. Defensive line 1, joint tenancy with right of survivorship. He explained how, with Charles's guidance, he had systematically restructured the ownership of every major asset we had. The house, the clinic, our investment portfolio, all of it was converted. Think of it as a legal minefield, he said, a grim smile touching his lips. The moment I'm gone, ownership of everything automatically and immediately transfers to you. It completely bypasses the will. It bypasses probate court. It bypasses them. They can't touch it. Then he pulled out another document. Defensive line 2, the Iron Will. It was a last will and testament, but it was drafted with the precision of a military order. It was airtight, witnessed by a judge and a senior partner at Charles's firm, and notarized. It bequeathed everything else, every book, every piece of furniture, every dollar in our personal accounts, directly to me, his beloved wife. My protector was leaving nothing to chance. I was speechless, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of his foresight, of his quiet, fierce protection. But he wasn't done. He reached back into the briefcase and pulled out one last item, a single, sealed envelope. And this, he said, his voice dropping low, is defensive line 3. This is the nuclear option. He pushed the envelope across the table to me. My name was written on the front in his familiar, steady handwriting. He explained, "That isn't a love letter, Molly. It's an indictment." For years, every time his family had slighted me, every time they'd made a cutting remark or a dismissive gesture, Marcus had gone home and written it down. He documented it all. The date, the time, the exact words used. He had recorded his mother's comment about my loud and temporary lifestyle. He had quoted his father's obsession with protecting the bloodline. He had noted down every single time his brothers had treated me like I was invisible. The letter, he explained, ended with one final, devastating paragraph. By treating my wife, a soldier who has sacrificed more for her country than you ever will for your family. As the enemy, you have forfeited your right to be called my family. You have shown me your true values, and I reject them. Therefore, you are to receive nothing from me but my contempt. A tear slid down my cheek, hot and sudden. He had seen. He had seen every paper cut, every invisible wound they had inflicted over the years, and he had turned them into a weapon to defend me. Marcus reached across the table and took my hand. His touch was firm, grounding me. Charles Piton has the original, signed and notarized, along with several certified copies. His instructions are explicit. If my family makes a single hostile move against you after I'm gone, he is to deploy everything. The property deeds, the will, and he is to read that letter aloud to them, in person. He looked me straight in the eye, and the weight of his love was staggering. "I am so sorry I'm leaving you with this fight, Major," he said, using my rank with a new kind of respect. It wasn't a mark of difference anymore. It was a title acknowledging my strength. "But I know you. I know you won't back down. I need you to promise me. Promise me you'll hold the line." In that moment, he wasn't my gentle husband anymore. He was my commanding officer, entrusting me with the most important mission of my life. The mission to honor his love and protect the life we built. I squeezed his hand, my voice clear and steady, all the tears gone. "Yes, sir," I said. "I'll hold the line." We had a plan. We had a fortress. We thought we had time. 6 weeks later, the word cancer entered our vocabulary, and the war we were preparing for suddenly had a terrifyingly short deadline. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The doctor said the words with quiet sympathy, his voice gentle, but they landed in the middle of our quiet life like a bomb, obliterating everything. The battle plan we had just drawn up, the one we thought was for a distant, hypothetical war, was suddenly on a brutally short timeline. The enemy wasn't just greed anymore, it was time itself. Marcus faced it like the quiet warrior I was beginning to realize he'd always been. After the doctor left the room, His first words to me weren't, "Why me?" or "I'm scared." He looked at me, his eyes clear and focused despite the devastating news, and said 2 words. "Call Charles." He was a pilot facing catastrophic engine failure, immediately running through his emergency checklist. There was no panic, only procedure. Those last few months were a blur of hospital visits, chemotherapy sessions that ravaged his body but never touched his spirit, and nights spent holding him, trying to absorb some of his pain into myself. In between it all, our mission continued. During his good hours, when the morphine gave him a window of clarity, he and Charles would speak on the phone or meet in the quiet of our living room. They worked with the urgency of soldiers fortifying a position before an inevitable assault. They finalized every detail, reviewed every document, and added one last, brilliant piece of ordnance to our arsenal: a no-contest clause. Charles explained it to me in simple terms. It was a tripwire. Anyone who dared to challenge the will in court would be automatically and completely disinherited, cut off from receiving even a single family photo. It was a perfect trap, designed for the greedy and the arrogant. As Marcus grew weaker, the vultures began to circle. His family started visiting, their faces masks of feigned concern. They would arrive bearing casseroles and bouquets of funereal lilies, filling our small home with the scent of false sympathy. Their performances were flawless, but their eyes gave them away. They weren't looking at Marcus, they were looking past him, at the house, the furniture, the assets. Raymond would walk through the rooms, a hand on his chin, as if inspecting a property for purchase. He'd run a hand along the door frames and tap the walls with his knuckles. Solid construction, he'd proclaim to no one in particular. They built things to last back then. He wasn't talking about our marriage. He was appraising the house. Patricia's tactics were more subtle, more insidious. She would bring homemade chicken soup in her expensive Le Creuset pot, sit by Marcus's bedside, and then turn her saccharine smile on me. "Molly, dear," she said one afternoon, her voice a soft purr. "Have you given any thought to your future? I imagine it would be much more convenient for your career if you were closer to a major base, like Fort Bragg in North Carolina." She was suggesting I move, planning my relocation while her son was dying in the next room. One day, she arrived with a glossy interior design catalog from Pottery Barn. "I just thought we could look at some ideas together," she said brightly, flipping through pages of perfectly arranged living rooms, "to give the house a little freshening up for when Gerald and his family eventually move in." She was asking for my opinion on how to redecorate my own home for my replacement. The audacity was breathtaking. Through it all, they rarely asked Marcus how he was feeling. They talked at him, around him, but never to him. They were waiting. And their waiting felt like a physical presence in the house, a cold, heavy shroud that suffocated what little peace we had left. The final, undeniable proof of their intentions came on a quiet Wednesday afternoon. Marcus was asleep in the hospital bed we'd set up in the living room. I was in the kitchen, carefully measuring out his medication, when I heard Gerald and Timothy talking in hushed tones in the hallway. I froze, listening. "Dad says we changed the locks the day after the funeral," Gerald said, his voice a low murmur. "Clean and quick." "Yeah," Timothy agreed. "Best to do it while she's busy with all that military paperwork stuff. Less of a scene that way." The syringe nearly slipped from my trembling hand. A wave of nausea washed over me. I looked over at Marcus. His eyes were open. He had heard every word. He was too weak to speak, but he reached out and squeezed my hand, a faint but firm pressure. A fire I thought had been extinguished by the illness flared in his eyes one last time. "See?" he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "Never underestimate their greed." He took a ragged breath. "Now you know what you have to do." He was giving me my final orders. The day of the funeral was gray and overcast, the Charleston sky weeping a warm, misty rain. I stood at the graveside in my Army service uniform, the green fabric feeling heavy and formal. I watched as the honor guard meticulously folded the flag that had draped his casket, their movements crisp and full of a reverence his own family lacked. When they presented the flag to me, a perfect tight triangle of stars and stripes, my composure finally cracked. For a moment, I was not Major Martin. I was just Molly, a woman who had lost her entire world. As the small crowd began to disperse, Raymond gathered his remaining family, Patricia, Gerald, and Timothy, into a tight, exclusive circle near the headstone. He intentionally positioned himself so his back was to me, physically pushing me to the periphery. I stood alone, holding the flag as he cleared his throat to make an announcement. In order to preserve Marcus's legacy, he declared, his voice thick with a counterfeit solemnity that made my stomach clench. And to provide stability for the next generation, we have decided that the house will be transferred to Gerald and his family. His son needs a proper place to grow up. My grief was instantly replaced by a cold, hard fury. I stepped forward. I am his family, I said, my voice quiet but cutting through the humid air. The house is my home. Raymond turned to face me, his expression not of sympathy but of cold dismissal. He looked at me as if I were a complete stranger, an interloper at a private family event. You are not his blood, Molly, he said, each word a final deliberate twist of the knife. And down here in the South, blood is all that matters. It was his final declaration of war, delivered over the fresh grave of his own son. The battle Marcus and I had prepared for was about to begin. I didn't go back to the base after the funeral. I didn't go anywhere. I spent the night in my Jeep, parked 2 blocks down the street from my house, hidden in the shadows of a massive live oak. I watched. My grief had been cauterized by Raymond's final insult at the cemetery, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged resolve. I knew they would move fast. Arrogance makes people predictable. At 8 a.m. the next morning, my surveillance paid off. A big white moving truck from a local company rumbled down the street and backed into my driveway with a screech of its brakes. The ambush was underway. A few minutes later, Gerald emerged from the house, clipboard in hand, already directing the movers with an air of self-importance. I didn't drive up. I didn't rush in screaming. That's what they expected. Instead, I started my engine, pulled out, and parked again at the corner of the block, giving myself a clear line of sight to the entire operation. From my driver's seat, I watched them carry out the first pieces of my life. The floor lamp Marcus and I had picked out together, a box of my books, the small kitchen table. My heart was a cold, steady drum against my ribs. There was no fear, no panic, just the focused calm that comes before a mission launch. I pulled out my phone. I didn't hesitate. I dialed the number Marcus had made me memorize. It rang twice. Piton, a deep, calm voice answered. Charles, it's Molly Martin, I said, my voice even and low. I kept my eyes fixed on the house. The operation is active. The hostiles are on site. They're removing assets from the property. I spoke in the language I knew best, the language of the military. It stripped the emotion away, leaving only the facts. There was a brief pause on the other end, then Charles's voice came back, just as calm, but with an undercurrent of steel. Understood, Major. Reinforcements are en route. ETA 10 minutes. He didn't say, I'll be right there. He said, reinforcements. The word was a promise. Hold your position, he added, then the line went dead. I put the phone down, took one more deep breath, and got out of the car. I walked, not ran, down the sidewalk. I didn't go to the front door. I walked to the end of the driveway and stopped, planting my feet squarely in the middle of it, blocking the path. Then I crossed my arms and waited. My posture was perfect. Back straight, shoulders squared, chin up. It was the stance of a soldier on guard duty, unmoving, unflinching, a human barrier. The movers, carrying a large sofa, saw me first. They hesitated, slowed, and then stopped, looking uncertainly from me to Gerald. Gerald, annoyed by the delay, stormed out of the house. What's the holdup? Let's go! Let's go! Then he saw me. His face twisted into a scowl. What the hell do you think you're doing? Get out of the way. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just held his gaze. My silence was a weapon. It was unnerving, defiant. It wasn't the reaction of a hysterical, grieving widow, and it threw him completely off balance. His father came out onto the porch, drawn by the commotion. What is it now? Raymond barked, his face red with irritation. When he saw me, he sneered. You again? I told you your time here is done. Leave before I have you removed for trespassing. Right as the word trespassing left his mouth, another sound joined the quiet morning. The deep, expensive purr of a German engine. A gleaming black BMW 7 Series glided down the street and came to a stop directly behind the moving truck, boxing it in. It wasn't just a car, it was a statement. It moved with the silent, predatory grace of a shark. The driver's side door opened and a man emerged. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a flawlessly tailored charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than my first car. This was Charles Peaton. He looked less like a lawyer and more like the man presidents call to fix their problems. He didn't even glance at me. His focus was entirely on the two men standing on the lawn. He walked with a calm, deliberate pace, his polished Italian shoes making no sound on the asphalt until he was standing directly in front of Raymond. Raymond Coleman, Charles asked, though it wasn't a question. His voice was a rich baritone, carrying an authority that demanded attention. Raymond, momentarily flustered by this unexpected arrival, puffed out his chest. I am. Who are you? My name is Charles Peaton, he said, extending a hand not for a handshake, but to present a business card. I am the legal counsel for the estate of the late Marcus Coleman, and I am the personal attorney for my client. He paused, turning his head slightly to nod at me with profound respect. Major Molly Martin. He said my rank like it was a royal title. The contrast between his deference and Raymond's contempt was stark and deliberate. Raymond's bravado began to crack. He looked from Charles to the impossibly expensive car, to me, standing like a statue at the end of the driveway. The gears were turning in his head, and he didn't like the calculation. Charles didn't give him time to recover. His voice became as cold and hard as a judge's gavel. I'm here to inform you, he said, his gaze sweeping over Raymond, Gerald, and Timothy, that you are currently engaged in illegal trespassing and the theft of private property belonging to my client. He let that sink in for a moment. I am instructing you to cease all activity immediately. Furthermore, every single item that has been removed from that house is to be returned to its original position. Now. He took a step closer. If my instructions are not followed to the letter within the next 5 minutes, he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more menacing, my next call will be to the Charleston chief of police, who happens to be a very dear friend of mine from law school, and all of you will be spending the night explaining yourselves in a downtown holding cell. The change was instantaneous. Raymond's face went from ruddy anger to a pasty, slack-jawed white. Gerald and Timothy looked like they'd been punched in the gut. The smug certainty they had worn like a uniform was gone, replaced by raw, dawning panic. They finally understood. They weren't fighting a grieving, solitary widow anymore. They were fighting the law. The battle had officially begun. There's a special kind of satisfaction in watching a bully finally meet their match, isn't there? If you've ever wanted to cheer for someone who stood their ground, hit that like button and comment with one word that describes how this moment makes you feel. Let's see words like finally, justice, or yes. Now that I have your attention, Charles said, his voice cutting through their stunned silence, I suggest we move this discussion inside. Charles didn't wait for an invitation. He swept past the stunned Coleman family, his powerful presence dominating the space before he even spoke a word. I followed a few steps behind, closing the front door with a quiet, definitive click. The battle had moved from the lawn to the living room. He walked directly to the gleaming mahogany dining table, the very same table where I had been judged and dismissed 8 years ago, and placed his crocodile leather briefcase upon it. He unlatched it with 2 sharp snaps that echoed in the tense silence. It sounded like a soldier chambering a round. Raymond, scrambling to regain some semblance of control, finally found his voice. It was strained, a poor imitation of his usual commanding tone. You have no right to be in this house. This is a private family matter. Charles looked up from his briefcase, a smile that held no warmth touching his lips. Mr. Coleman, he said, his voice dangerously soft. When the assets in question are valued in the 7-figure range, and when my client is being illegally evicted from her own home, it ceases to be a family matter. it becomes a legal matter. And in this matter, he paused, straightening up to his full, imposing height, I have every right to be here. He reached into the briefcase and pulled out the first file. It was thick, bound in blue. Let's start with the basics, shall we? He said, his tone that of a professor lecturing a particularly slow class. He slid a sheaf of papers across the polished wood toward Raymond. These are the deeds to this house, the veterinary clinic on King Street, and the waterfront property down by the Ashley River. As you can see, they were all refiled several years ago under a joint tenancy with right of survivorship. He let the legal term hang in the air. For the benefit of those unfamiliar with estate law, he continued, his eyes locking onto Raymond's. That means that 1 second after Marcus Coleman passed away, Major Martin became the sole and undisputed owner of all 3 properties. The transfer was automatic and absolute. Your actions today, therefore, constitute illegal trespassing. Gerald made a choking sound. That's not possible. Oh, it's very possible, Charles said without glancing at him. He pulled out a second document. And just in case anyone felt the need to argue the point, Marcus also drafted this. He laid out a will. This is his last will and testament, legally executed, witnessed, and notarized. It is, for all intents and purposes, ironclad. It clearly states that all remaining assets, tangible and intangible, are bequeathed to his wife, Major Molly Martin. Patricia finally broke her stunned silence. No, she stammered, shaking her head, her carefully constructed composure beginning to crumble. No, Marcus wouldn't. He would never do that to his own family. Charles turned his cold, analytical gaze on her. He spoke with a brutal lack of pity. Madam, not only would your son do this, he anticipated this exact reaction from you. His hand went back to the file, flipping to another page marked with a yellow tab. You see, Marcus was a very thorough man. His will contains a particularly stringent no-contest clause. He looked around the room, making eye contact with each of them, Raymond, Patricia, Gerald, Timothy. That clause stipulates that if any beneficiary, he stressed the word, attempts to challenge the validity of this will in any way, for any reason, they are to be treated as if they had predeceased the testator. In layman's terms, you are immediately and irrevocably cut off. You forfeit any and all inheritance, down to the smallest sentimental keepsake Marcus might have left for you. He leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the table. The friendly professor was gone, replaced by a ruthless prosecutor delivering his closing argument. Your son laid a trap, Mr. and Mrs. Coleman, and with your little performance this morning, you didn't just walk into it, you sprinted. The color drained from their faces. The furious red of Raymond's anger faded to a pasty, sickly white. Patricia's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horrified understanding. For the first time since I had met them, the Coleman family was completely, utterly silent. They were defeated, and they knew it. They had been outmaneuvered, outsmarted, and legally disarmed by the son they had always underestimated. I stood by the door, my arms still crossed, a silent sentinel watching the fortress Marcus had built for me withstand the siege. Charles glanced over at me, his expression unreadable, but his eyes gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture of respect between allies, a confirmation that the first phase of the mission was a success. He then turned back to the broken family. But Marcus knew, Charles said, his voice dropping again, drawing them in. He knew that legal documents, as powerful as they are, might not be enough to penetrate the unique culture of your family. He knew a stronger blow was needed. One aimed not at your wallets, but at your conscience. He reached into his briefcase one last time and pulled out the sealed envelope, the one with my name on it. He held it up between his thumb and forefinger. If you still have any doubt as to your son's final intentions, Charles said, if you still cling to the delusion that this is all some terrible misunderstanding, then perhaps you should hear it from him. He paused, letting the weight of his words fill the room. And that, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, was just the opening salvo. Are you interested in hearing the final words Marcus really wanted to say to his family? No one answered him. No one could. The air in the room, already thick with tension, became heavy with a new emotion. Dread. The Coleman family, who had entered my home with such arrogance and entitlement, now stood frozen, trapped between the legal fortress Charles had just revealed and the emotional bombshell he was about to detonate. Charles took their stunned silence as consent. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a pair of sleek, black reading glasses, unfolding them with a deliberate, almost ceremonial slowness. He slipped them on, his expression becoming solemn, as if he were a priest about to read a sacred text. He carefully broke the seal on the envelope Marcus had prepared, the sound of the tearing paper unnaturally loud in the silent room. He unfolded the single sheet of stationery inside and cleared his throat. His voice, when he began to read, was no longer that of a lawyer. It was the voice of a man carrying out a sacred duty. It was the voice of Marcus. To my family, he began, his voice filling the room with a weight that was almost physical. If you are hearing these words, it means I am no longer there to stand between my soldier and your cruelty. This is a private matter, Raymond finally croaked, his voice cracking. He took a half step forward, a pathetic attempt to reassert his lost authority. Charles didn't even look up from the page. Your son's instructions were explicit, Mr. Coleman, he said, his voice cutting through Raymond's protest like glass. This letter was to be read aloud, publicly, in the event of any hostile action taken against his wife. You, he paused, finally lifting his eyes to pin Raymond with a cold stare, have more than met that condition. He returned his gaze to the letter, and the weight of Marcus's words descended again. For 8 years, you have looked at Molly, and you have seen nothing but a uniform. You saw her sacrifice as a flaw, her courage as an inconvenience, and her dedication as a threat to your neat, orderly world of inherited privilege. The words landed like stones, each one finding its target. You saw a soldier, but you refused to see the woman. The one who held my hand through every fear, who celebrated every small victory, who loved me not for my name, but for my heart. Charles's voice continued, a relentless, posthumous accounting of their sins. He turned his head slightly towards Raymond. Dad, you demanded she sign a prenuptial agreement because you don't trust in love. You only trust in bloodlines. You tried to reduce the most important relationship of my life to a business transaction. You failed. He then shifted his focus to Patricia, who was now visibly trembling, her manicured hands clutching each other. Mom, you took the beautiful cashmere scarf she spent weeks knitting for you, a heartfelt offering of peace, and you gave it to the housekeeper in front of her. Because in your eyes, her effort, her time, her very essence had no value. It was a gesture of such casual cruelty that it told me everything I needed to know. Patricia let out a choked sob, a sound of pure, undiluted shame. It wasn't a cry of grief or remorse. It was the sound of a woman whose perfect public mask had just been shattered into 1,000 pieces. Charles didn't relent. His gaze fell upon Gerald and Timothy, who were now trying to shrink into the wallpaper. And Gerald, Timothy, my brothers. You whispered behind her back. You treated her like a temporary occupant in her own home, already planning how to divide up her life before it was even broken. You saw her love for me not as a bond, but as an obstacle to your inheritance. Every accusation was true. Every word was a mirror forcing them to see the ugliness of their own actions, stripped of all polite Southern pretense. There was nowhere to hide. Then the tone of the letter and of Charles's voice shifted. The cold fury melted away, replaced by a warmth so profound it made my own breath catch in my throat. You never understood. Charles read, his voice now filled with a deep, loving reverence. You saw her being a soldier as the problem. You were so wrong. I loved her because she is a soldier. She taught me what real honor looks like. She taught me about loyalty. Not to a name or a bank account, but to a person, to a set of values. She taught me how to stand up for what is right, even when you are standing alone. He paused, letting the words settle. Molly was my moral compass. She was the best part of me. This house was never just brick and mortar to us. It was our fortress, a sanctuary we built together against a world that did not always understand. And you do not, he read, his voice ringing with Marcus's conviction. Take a fortress from a soldier. The tears that had been threatening finally fell, rolling silently down my cheeks. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of pride. Tears of being seen, of being known, of being loved so completely. He had seen me, all of me, and he had loved me for it. And now, even after he was gone, he was still fighting for me. Charles took a deep breath before reading the final, devastating paragraph. His voice became hard again, each word a final judgment. So, listen to this, and listen carefully. Everything I have, everything I have ever worked for, belongs to her. This is not a gift. It is an acknowledgement of her worth. By attacking her in her moment of greatest vulnerability, you have proven yourselves unworthy of any part of me. My true legacy is not in my assets or in the Coleman name. My true legacy is the love I have for this woman and the life we built. Charles looked up from the page, making eye contact with each of them one last time before delivering the final, crushing blow. He read the last sentence not as a request, but as a direct, unyielding order from their son. Now, get out of her house. When the last word echoed into silence, the room was utterly still. It was the dead, heavy silence of a battlefield after the fighting is over. The game was over. They had lost. Raymond stumbled backward, his legs giving out from under him. He collapsed into a dining chair, not with the grace of a patriarch, but with the limp, boneless fall of a puppet whose strings have been cut. He stared into the middle distance, a completely broken man, defeated not by a lawyer, but by the ghost of his own son. The silence held for a long moment, thick and suffocating with the ghosts of Marcus's words. Raymond sat slumped in the dining chair, a man hollowed out from the inside. Then Charles broke the stillness. His voice was calm, devoid of triumph, but it held the unyielding force of a turning tide. "All right," he said, looking directly at Gerald and Timothy, who were still frozen in disbelief. "You heard the man. Let's start bringing it all back." What followed was the most surreal and satisfying theater I've ever witnessed. Under the watchful, unblinking gaze of Charles Peaton, the great Coleman retreat began. Gerald and Timothy, the arrogant heirs who had never done a day of manual labor in their lives, were now sweating under the Charleston sun, their expensive polo shirts sticking to their backs. They grunted and strained as they hauled furniture and boxes back into the house they had so confidently tried to claim. They moved with the sullen, resentful silence of defeated soldiers forced to clean their own mess. Raymond didn't move. He just sat there, aged a decade in an hour, his face a gray mask of ruin. Patricia, however, made one last, desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage. She approached me as I stood by the door, her face a mess of tear-streaked makeup and pleading. "Molly," she began, her voice a pathetic whisper. "Molly, please, we can talk about this." I didn't feel anger anymore. I didn't feel anything except a vast, weary distance. I held up my hand, a simple, quiet gesture to stop her. "There is no we, Mrs. Coleman," I said, my voice calm and final. It was the first time I'd ever called her that. There never was. It was the simplest boundary I'd ever set and the most powerful. It was a wall she could not breach. She recoiled as if I had struck her, then turned and retreated to her husband's side, finally defeated. Before they left, I had one final command. I walked over to Charles and murmured something in his ear. He nodded. "One last thing," he announced. "My client requests that her grandmother's armchair be returned. By you." He pointed at Gerald and Timothy, and placed exactly where it was. The humiliation was complete. I watched them awkwardly maneuver the floral armchair, my last piece of my own family, back to its rightful place beside the fireplace. It was more than just a piece of furniture. It was the restoration of order. It was justice. News in a city like Charleston travels faster than a summer thunderstorm. It moves in whispers at the country club, in hushed phone calls between the wives of prominent men, in the gossip exchanged over bridge games and charity luncheons. The story of how the proud Coleman family had tried to dispossess a decorated Army major, their own widowed daughter-in-law, and had been so spectacularly defeated, became the scandal of the season. The consequences were swift and brutal. Raymond, a man who lived for his social standing, became a pariah. He stopped showing up for his morning tea time at the club. Patricia, who chaired 3 different charity boards, was quietly asked to step down from all of them. Gerald's plan to buy the clinic fell apart. Dr. Henderson, a man of quiet integrity, refused to do business with him after hearing what had happened. They hadn't just lost a legal battle. They had lost the one thing they valued more than money: their reputation. Their carefully constructed Southern dynasty had crumbled into dust. About a week later, a thick, cream-colored envelope arrived in my mailbox. It was from Raymond. Inside, there was a stiffly worded letter full of excuses disguised as an apology. He wrote about his grief, his desire to protect the family, his misunderstanding of Marcus's wishes. Tucked inside the letter was a cashier's check for $100,000. I stared at it. It was blood money. A final insulting attempt to buy my silence, my forgiveness, my complicity. He still didn't get it. He thought this was all about money. I walked into the kitchen, to the stainless steel sink. I took out the cheap Bic lighter I keep in a drawer for lighting candles. I flicked it on, the small flame dancing in the quiet room. I held the corner of the check to the flame and watched as the fire consumed Raymond's guilt money. It curled into blackened, fragile ash, the numbers and his signature disappearing into nothing. It wasn't an act of anger. It was an act of liberation. I scooped the ashes into the envelope the check had come in, sealed it without a note, and mailed it back to him. The message was clear: we were done. That night, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the house was truly quiet. Not the heavy, oppressive silence of grief, but a deep, peaceful stillness. I sat in my grandmother's armchair, its familiar floral pattern a comforting presence in the dimly lit room. I didn't feel triumphant, not really. The victory didn't taste sweet. It was just quiet. It was the profound relief of a soldier after a long and brutal war. The adrenaline was gone, leaving behind only a bone-deep weariness and a sense of peace. I had fought not for revenge, but for preservation. For the sanctity of the life Marcus and I had built. The mission was accomplished. My eyes fell on the letter from Marcus, which I had placed on the mantelpiece. The paper was still unfolded, a silent testament to his love and foresight. He had drawn the map. He had supplied the arsenal. But I was the one who had to stand on the battlefield. I was the one who had to hold the line, and I had won. And now, the battlefield was quiet. The question was, what does a soldier do when the war is over? What do you build on the ground you fought so hard to protect? The answer to my question, what do you build on the ground you fought so hard to protect, didn't come in a single moment of revelation. It arrived quietly, piece by piece, over the next 6 months, like the slow, steady Charleston dawn breaking over the harbor. It began not with a grand design, but with a simple decision. I would not sell the clinic. That place was Marcus's heart translated into a physical space. To sell it would have felt like a betrayal. So, with Charles Piton's help navigating the business side of things, I kept it open. The first change I made was a new sign out front. It no longer said Coleman Veterinary Clinic. It now read the Marcus Coleman Memorial Animal Hospital. I was still an active duty officer, but my weekends changed. Instead of catching up on sleep or running errands, I started spending my Saturdays at the clinic. I wasn't a vet, of course, but I could answer phones, comfort anxious pet owners in the waiting room, and clean kennels. The clinic staff, who had adored Marcus, welcomed me with open arms. Slowly, something beautiful began to happen. Because of my uniform, other military families started coming in. A young Marine sergeant whose pit bull needed surgery he couldn't afford. A Navy family, new to town, whose golden retriever had eaten something it shouldn't have. They came for their pets, but they stayed for the community. The clinic's waiting room became an unofficial gathering spot, a place where military spouses could share advice over a cup of coffee, where soldiers could talk freely without having to explain their lives. It was no longer just a place for healing animals. It was becoming a place for healing people, too. It was becoming a sanctuary. That's when the real plan took shape. I realized what Marcus's true legacy needed to be. 6 months to the day after the confrontation in my living room, I found myself standing in front of a group of bright-eyed, newly graduated veterinarians from Tuskegee University. I had invited them to the clinic to talk about a new initiative I was launching. I was no longer just a soldier or a widow. I was a founder. "Good morning," I began, my voice steady and sure. "My name is Molly Martin, and I want to tell you about my husband, Marcus." I told them about his gentle spirit, his incredible skill, and his two core beliefs. Marcus believed that animals have a unique ability to heal the wounds we can't see, I said, looking at each of them. The wounds of loneliness, of trauma, of loss. He called them the best medics in the world. He also believed that the men and women who serve this country, and the families who stand beside them, deserve our unwavering support and the best care we can offer. I gestured around the bustling clinic. That's why I've established the Marcus Martin Companion Fund. It's a nonprofit dedicated to providing free or low-cost veterinary care to the pets of active duty service members and veterans in need. This fund is how we will continue both of his core beliefs. It's how his legacy will live on, not just in a name on a sign, but in action, in service. I was no longer fighting a war. I was building a monument of love. Later that week, while organizing Marcus's old desk at the clinic, my fingers brushed against a loose panel in the back of the main drawer. Curious, I worked it free. Tucked inside was another envelope, this one old and slightly faded. It was addressed simply to Molly, my soldier. My heart leaped into my throat. It was a letter he must have written right after we had our war room meeting, a final message he had hidden for me to find one day. My hands trembled as I opened it. "My dearest Molly," it began. "If you're reading this, it means the worst has happened, but it also means our plan is in motion. I know you'll win. I never had a doubt. You are the strongest person I have ever known. But I need you to know something. Winning the battle isn't the end of the mission. It's the beginning of the next one. Your new mission, Major, is to live. Live a life that is full and joyful and loud, just like my mother was always so afraid of. Live it for yourself, not for me. Grieve me, but don't let that grief be the end of your story. Let it be the foundation of a new chapter. Our house was our fortress, built to protect us. Now, I need you to turn that fortress into a lighthouse. Let it be a beacon of strength and hope for others. My love will always be your reinforcements, your air support, your flank security. I will always be watching your six. Hold the line, and then build something beautiful on it." I folded the letter, holding it to my chest. The last piece of the puzzle had clicked into place. He hadn't just left me a battle plan. He had left me a blueprint for peace. The story ends here, but my life did not. It ends this morning, with the Charleston sun rising, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I'm standing on the porch of my house, dressed in my PT uniform, gray shirt, black shorts, ready for my morning run. The air is cool and smells of salt from the nearby sea. Behind me, the house stands quiet and strong. It's no longer just a fortress. Marcus was right. It's a lighthouse. I held the line. I completed the mission. And now, every single day, a new mission begins. To live, to heal, and to pass on a legacy not of bloodlines or of wealth, but of honor, service, and a love that was strong enough to build a fortress and gentle enough to light the way home. My war is over, but I know many of you might still be on your own battlefields, fighting quietly every day. The greatest weapon I had wasn't just Marcus's brilliant plan. It was having a loyal ally like Charles Piton show up when I needed him most. In the comments below, I would be honored if you would share who your Charles Piton has been. That one person who stood with you and helped you hold the line. These stories of resilience and quiet courage deserve to be heard. If you believe that too and want to be part of this community, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss the next story from the front lines of life.